Okay, so welcome back to Sociology 1301. We're going to talk about the family today, family and household diversity. And first, we're going to go ahead and define a family. So, a family is a set of people related by blood, marriage, or other agreed upon relationship or adoption who share primary responsibility for reproduction and caring for members of society. The family is considered an institution just like the post office, just like the government, just like the school. It is another institution that we use in society. One type of family is the nuclear family, and this is the married couple and their unmarried children all living together. So here's a nice picture of the Simpsons, who do a pretty good job as an example for the nuclear family. Then you have the extended family. So the extended family is where relatives live nearby their parents and their children, but they are not part of the nuclear family itself. So these are uncles and aunts and cousins, grandparents would all be considered part of your extended family, specifically if they live nearby and you see them. Okay, so this is kind of how you make up a family. Usually there need to be two adults who are engaged in a relationship, and these types of relationships can be monogamous. So in monogamy, you have an individual having one partner, and typically they keep this partner. The idea is to keep them for life, but you do have this scenario where you have serial monogamy, and that's when a person has several spouses in their lifetime, but only one at a time. So here you have Liz Taylor. She was actually famously married to 8 different men, all at different times. So you can see that trends and the composition of family has really changed over time. So in the 1960s, you have 73% of families made up of 2 parents who were in their first marriage, and by 2014 that number has decreased to 46%. If you look at the bottom, you can see that there's not much of a difference in 2 marriages, 2 parents in a remarriage, but cohabitation has got its own category now. And 7% of the population, let me correct that, 7% of families being made up of cohabitating parents is a pretty high figure if you look back to the 60s where it didn't exist. Also, you might notice the huge increase in single parenting. That can be another large fact. Sometimes that goes along with cohabitating because we can't always know that somebody that's giving birth in a hospital without a partner, whether they are cohabitating or not, if they are not legally married. So sometimes those figures can be hard to track. Okay, and so this is the composition of families. So polygamy, which you've probably heard of before. This is when an individual has several husbands or wives simultaneously. The big broad term for that is polygamy. These are different types of polygamy. So polygyny, this is what you see with sister wives or big love or big love, and I'm trying to think of another one. There's been several different shows about this. This would be polygyny. Polyamory is different. Polyamory is when a person can have a partner. You can have a wife, and you can have a husband and a wife at the same time, and your husband and your wife can also be together. It's not necessarily legal wives, but they are exclusive relationships that people get into with some agreed upon relationship to each other, and those come in all sorts of varieties. Then you also have polyandry, and this is when there is one wife and many husbands. Polyandry is a lot less common. Typically you see that in societies where women are severely oppressed. Okay, so kinship patterns. So kinship is really just the state of being related to others. So if you look at your descent patterns, we have a bilateral descent pattern in my family. That means that both sides of a person's family are regarded as equally important. So we put a lot of importance in knowing both relatives from my mother's side and my father's side, and things get passed on from my mother's side to her and from my father's side to him, and so that will just continue. In a patrilineal descent, this is usually what you see, especially in history, where the father's relatives are important in terms of property, inheritance, and emotional ties. So you would just kind of tend to stay with the husband's family, and then property would be passed on to sons, and they would continue to own the property this way. The opposite of that would be matrilineal descent. This is when the mother's relatives are seen as more important than the father's, and in some Native American families, the matrilineal descent is strictly followed. So now we want to know who rules. Okay, so in patriarchy, you have males expecting to dominate all the family decision making. And so here I just put a judge, right? So now dad's the judge, but it's not always the father. It's also can be considered brothers, uncles. They're the ones that have all of the authority to make rules. Then you have matriarchy, and this is when the women in the family have greater authority than the men. This typically happens when men are at war and women are left back home. They typically end up taking on more of the authority. And then you have the egalitarian family, and this is when both spouses are regarded as equals. And this is typically what you see modeled in America. This is how a lot of people want to live their lives throughout their family decision making. Okay, so here are the sociological perspectives on the family. First, I want to ask you, do we really need a family? And if you would say yes, then we want to see kind of how does family function. So within the functionalist perspective, you have 6 different roles for society. So the family helps society move in terms of reproduction. So this is obviously, you get married, then you have children, right? So the family facilitates that through marriage, legitimate children. Then you have protection. So this is obviously, you strengthen numbers. And you have socialization, which we've talked about, where the family kind of teaches you how to act. Were you raised in a barn? I bet you make your mother proud. These are things that we say when people don't act right. And so proper socialization happens in the home from the family. Then you have sexual regulation. So this is when the family teaches the children, who is appropriate to procreate with, right? And to, monitor purity. I have heard that there's been people in the news, celebrities, that have tried to take their daughters to the doctor and to make sure that they are still pure. I think that this is a bit extreme, but sexual regulation nevertheless does happen within the family. This is like, dads are trying to keep their daughters pure, and we're also trying to teach our sons, what it means to have a child, right? The responsibilities of becoming a father. And so we try to limit our children's behavior, sexual behavior. So you also have affection and companionship in the family, and you have social status. So social status does get passed on from families, as we learned about social class earlier in the semester, a few slides ago, that social status comes directly from the family in the upper class, and typically even in the lower class, or in the lower classes. Okay, so here's a comic that's saying, this is yours, son. It's been in the family for generations. So you have just kind of generational poverty. And this would be a very conflict perspective of looking at the family. So the family reflects inequality in wealth and power, and you can find that within society and passed on through generations. And in a wide range of societies, husbands exercise power and authority within the family. And in order to look closer to that, family is seen as an economic unit that contributes to social injustice, at least in terms of how the conflict perspective looks at it. So kind of piggybacking off of Marx, the feminist perspective takes this idea that the marriage enables the husband, as the head of household, to exploit his wife by benefiting from her unpaid labor around the home, in support of his job, and producing and looking after children. These are all things that are not paid, but they are great deals of labor. They're not even factored into GDP, although I would say that if women were paid for the jobs that they're doing at home, and some men, the unpaid home labor would be very high. So if you are interested in this, you can look at the Marriage Contract is a work contract by Christine Delphi. She dives into this. She's a French sociologist. She's still around today, and she looks at how this work is broken up between not just men and women, but how women are oppressed within the marriage or the institution of marriage. Feminists also want to look at how women's work outside the home impacts childcare and their housework duties, and also looking at families that do not have males present in them, who do not have a father figure. A lot of times this has been said to be detrimental for children and for upbringing good citizens, but there are obviously instances where this is not true. So feminists would, take a great deal of care looking into that. Another thing that's not mentioned in your book, though, is that feminists also want to look at how men's roles in the home have changed over time, and men taking paternity leave after a baby comes, or women returning to work, and men who are staying home. These are all things that the feminist perspective would look at. So now you're looking at the interactionist perspective, and this is a micro level view of the family and intimate relationships. And the beauty of the interactionist perspective is it's not really taking any kind of side on whether the family is good or bad. It really wants to look closer at what are these roles within the family. Specifically, they're interested in the role of a step-parent. So, what does it mean to be a stepfather? Because it's a little bit different of a relationship than having reproductive rights, but you're still within a family, so you still are serving some of those roles. And so within the micro level, how do people understand stepfather or stepmom? Here's some interesting mugs that I found. You can also look at greeting cards as a interactionist to see how do people make sense of family life or their roles within the family. Okay, this is a new theory for us. We haven't talked about this yet. This is the social exchange theory. So this talks about how people do a cost-benefit analysis before they engage in a relationship. And people tend to seek out rewards and avoid punishments, just in general. And so when a person begins an interaction to gain the maximum profit with the minimal cost, they're looking at, this relationship as what's in it for me. And so people know that this payoff will vary from person to person as well as with the same person over time. And so the costs of a relationship are obviously things or traits a person may see as negative, and the benefits are things or traits a person may see as positive. So this is kind of when you go along with some kind of social contract, you have some expectations based off of how you were treated in the past, and so that may determine whether you engage in the next relationship or not. So if the costs outweigh the benefits, then the relationship likely dissolves. However, you also see there's this evaluation of alternatives. It prevents the decision to be automatic. So if you don't have a lot of alternatives to a situation, then you might stay in a relationship that is not good for you, or whether maybe you can't do any better. This is what you hear sometimes from people when they say, well, you'll never have anybody as good as me. So social exchange theory can be a really great tool to analyze relationships and human behavior, why we make the decisions to be with the people that we are with. Also, why do we invest in our children? These are relationships as well. Also, when you look at family ties, there's been a study actually on family ties that are showing how do difficult relationships work out in families. So when maybe you have an elderly parent that you're taking care of, but maybe you don't have the best relationship, or you're not really getting a lot of benefit out of it, that it's basically just costing you a lot. Well, when they look at family ties, they're also looking at how your relationship with maybe a sibling, maybe you're sharing this responsibility with a sibling, and so therefore there's a greater social exchange involved within family ties. So you may be tied to a family member that you don't particularly like, or that is costing you a whole lot. But I would ask you, if you're looking through a social exchange perspective, I would ask you to look at that relationship in terms of, well, what are the benefits? There might be some indirect benefits that you're having within a relationship. That's how they would look at these different perspectives on the family. So a sociologist would look at the functionalist family as the contributor to social stability and the roles of family members, how they serve the family. Conflict looks at family as the perpetuator of inequality, generational poverty. The feminist looks at the family as gender roles, unpaid labor. Also wants to look at female-headed households and how those work. Interactionist has an emphasis on the relationships among and between family members. And the social exchange theory is looking at these egocentric networks and how agency and structure of relationships function within the family. Okay, so social institutions and distinctive cultural norms and values play an important role in romance and mate selection. So when you're looking for a spouse, you go through courtship. This is when you are deciding who you're going to marry, and it is actually greatly influenced by the norms and values of the larger society. So internet romance has been a newer kind of phenomenon, at least in the history of sociology, which has been going on since Durkheim, since Auguste Comte. So now we have, I don't think they would have ever saw this coming, with Tinder or Match.com or eHarmony or OkCupid or any of these different sites that people use to court, to mate. It is taking much longer now than it did in the past, just because people are less likely to get married, as we saw even within the family unit. There's cohabitating partners who are not married. So marriage is not happening as soon or as often. So these are different types of mate selection. So you have endogamy or endogamy. This specifies groups within which a spouse must be found. Specifies groups within which spouse must be found. It prohibits marriage with members of other groups. So you want to keep everybody together, right? You want to marry within your group, whatever group that is. Exogamy, that is when mate selection is outside your certain group, usually family or certain kin. So with exogamy, you have marriage of, probably outside your religion, outside your class, outside of your race, ethnicity, culture, um, age. There's probably a few that I'm missing, but yeah. So the incest taboo, this is where, you know, sexual relationships between culturally specified relationships is prohibited. And so this is definitely in terms of really close kin, that we know that with incest that it can breed a lot of problems within just your DNA and genetics, that this is often when you see mutations happen. And just to prevent that, because that would be a major problem for society if these relationships were becoming sexual in nature, because this would be the ruin of a lot of our future, genetically speaking. So we also do this culturally. You don't think of step siblings, even though they don't have that genetic tie. It would still be seen as taboo to marry a step sibling or even like a third cousin, even though these are not considered relationships within a family that would result in some kind of genetic mutation. They would still be considered taboo in our culture, although it was not always a taboo in royal families. Okay, so you have homogamy, which I gave y'all a great video. I will link it up here in case you haven't seen it yet, but this is for you to comment on for your weekly discussion. And this is just a brilliant professor. He talks about this is the conscious or unconscious tendency to select a mate with personal characteristics that are similar to your own. And I would challenge you to look at, who do you think you will marry in the future? Or if you are already married, is this somebody that shares a lot of characteristics with you? Are they very similar to you? Okay, so we have this huge emphasis on love in the United States. U.S. parents and peers are expected to have or to help confine the search for a mate through socially acceptable members of the opposite sex. So sometimes we do have families that say, well, that person isn't appropriate for you, or you're not good enough for my daughter. And many world cultures give priority to factors other than romantic feelings. And so this would be where you have arranged marriages, right? Or maybe this is a better deal. Maybe this contract will work out a little bit better for the survival, of you, of your future family, of your, it makes more logistical sense. Whereas, romance, obviously not always the most practical of factors in a relationship. But I would also say that despite what we think about love, we do see that marriages tend to be a lot more successful if the families get along, if the in-laws get along, if the parents approve of the relationship. That tends to be a lot more supportive in the long run, and can keep people staying in the relationship for a much longer period of time. So there are variations in family life and intimate relationships. So obviously social class differences within families. So we talked about the functional parts of the family. This goes along with this. There emphasizes the lineage and the maintenance of the family position. This is telling you how families look different depending on social class. So one interesting thing is that the more education that you have, the less likely you are to get a divorce. Okay, so dual income families. This has been a huge change in society since the 60s. So among married people between 25 and 64, 96% of men and 69% of women are active in the labor force. That was as of 2010. This number has undoubtedly increased, and this is due to economic need. We both want to pursue careers. We both need two incomes in order to make ends meet or to maintain the kind of lifestyle that we want. And then you also have a rise in single-parent families. So this is when only one parent is present to care for children. And so there used to be a huge stigma attached to unwed mothers and other single parents. But this has diminished over time as the number of single-parent families has increased. It can be very stressful as a single parent. I can tell you that with my personal experience, that it's a lot easier with two adults. Now, it's not always easier if one of those adults is a problem, right? If one of those adults is not functioning within their role, sometimes the single parent family is the best way for the children. We don't often think that, but it is sometimes the case where it's better for a family and for the children if one of the parents is single and raises them on their own. So households headed by single fathers have increased, it says more than quadrupled from 1980 to 2013. And so this is an interesting trend. Also, step families are on the rise. So with rising rates of divorce, you also have an increase in remarriage. And so there are a lot of families that have a step family component. Sometimes they call them bonus families. These are considered the blended family. It has a lot of social significance for adults and children. And children are not always better off in a blended family. Sometimes they could still be better off in a single parent household. Okay, and so there are alternatives to traditional families. We talked about some of those earlier with polygyny and polyamory. So the U.S. family life includes competing commitments that sometimes undermine a marriage. So sometimes we don't always think that traditional marriage is the best way of going. We believe in self-expression and personal growth. Sometimes when people aren't getting along and they're married, you'll hear lots of advice saying, you should leave him, you should get out of that, or you should leave her. I wouldn't put up with that. We have embraced kind of divorce as part of the marriage story. And we see in other countries that there's definitely a stark difference between support of marriage and discouraging divorce, and also just treating cohabitation the same as we treat marriage. So the statistical trends in divorce rates did increase in the late 1960s, but they've actually leveled off. And so it's declined since the 1980s to 30%, or by 30%. So most of this is because less people are married. So it's a lot harder to get divorced if you're not married to begin with. They also say or show that men are more likely to get remarried once they've been married than women. And definitely remarriage can lead to a lot more complex kin networks. Now you may have grandparents, extended family that are step families or part of your step family. Greater social acceptance of divorce has increased. We've talked about that too, but these contributing factors are more liberal divorce laws. So now you can have you can just decide to get divorced. There doesn't have to be any kind of, foul play. You also have fewer children, higher incomes, and with greater opportunities for women. There's a lot less oppression. They're more free to leave a situation because they can support themselves. National study. Okay, so there's been a national study that looked at children before and after divorce, and they found out of 6,332 children that the behavior of the children didn't suffer based off of the divorce. This is in contrast to other reports that show that there's a lot more unhappiness for children who live within parental conflict. Okay, so within lesbian gay relationships, some lesbians and gay men live alone or with roommates. Other than Others are in long-term monogamous relationships. There are some couples that have been together, um, 50 years, celebrating their 50th anniversary. Um, it still happens. Then you can be monogamous and be in a gay relationship. Those work. 2015, there was a huge movement, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution guarantees the right to same-sex marriage, and this applies nationwide. And so now you have some same-sex divorce complications, and significant barriers remain for LGBTQ people. So just because you've been able to get married doesn't mean that there's equality. Okay, so marriage has lost much of its social significance as a rite of passage. You can be an adult without being married now. Used to be shown that, if you were not married as a female, by the time you were 30, that you were an old maid. And that's definitely changed as cohabitation has increased. If you don't know what cohabitation means, here's a definition for you. It's a lot more common in Europe, but there are a lot of, it says about half of currently married couples in the U.S. live together before marriage, so they did cohabitate. And also more people are remaining single. They did a poll, Pew Research did a poll of why younger people are not getting married, and a lot of them are saying, well, they just don't have what they need yet. They want to get to a certain part in their lives and their careers before they get married to somebody. And what they don't know is that actually 2 incomes are better than 1. Sometimes you can accomplish a lot more within a marriage than you can outside of one. So another kind of taboo thing is to be married without children. So a lot of people, I know grandparents are like, when are you going to give me some grandchildren? And there are some marriages, there are some people that just choose to get married and not have children. There can be a childless marriage. Many couples today consider themselves child-free rather than childless. And 16 to 17% of women will complete childbearing years without bearing children. It is very expensive to raise a child. So that is also another idea. And so living arrangements of adults, we talked about this previously. Here's some other stats on that, comparing 1967 to 2014. And this concludes this slide, this presentation. So I would encourage you to go to this video now and get an overview of how marriage works with some additional information to summarize. And I hope that this video has helped you. And I will see you later.